You're listening to Big Table, a podcast about books and conversation presented by Hat and Beard Press, Dub Lab, and Gold Diggers in Los Angeles. I'm your host, JC Gabel. For each episode, we speak to one author about a singular book in a long-form interview. Each interview is then followed by a brief reading, sometimes from the same book being discussed, sometimes by a like-minded title and a different author. But every episode does retain a loose theme throughout, and is inspired by the work of radio host and oral historian Studs Terkel. Thanks for listening. Why do some book covers grab your attention while others never get a second glance? In the look of the book, published by 10 Speed Press, author, designer, and creative director Peter Mendelsund and literary scholar David Alworth have dissected literature through notable book covers and the stories behind them. Using words and images as well as design thinking and literary criticism, the look of the book goes behind the scenes of the book cover design process. Mendelsund, who started his accidental career as a designer after years of practice as a classical concert pianist, released 2 books several years ago. That's when we first met. One was a monograph of his cover designs up until that point, entitled Cover, published by Powerhouse Books. And the other, a study of cover design as well, entitled What We See When We Read, published by Vintage Books. But back to the look of the book. In some ways, it's a sequel to his last book, but it began as a lecture at Harvard and was eventually expanded into this essential tome. If you love book cover design, this will be your Bible. Mendelsund and I spoke earlier this year as he was finishing work on his latest issue of The Atlantic, where he currently works as the creative director. Here's my conversation with Peter Mendelsund. This class you guys taught was the sort of history of the commercial book jacket, which goes back 130 plus years. And then, how different was the class syllabus really from what ended up being the final book?
Actually, totally different kind of class. In fact, what had happened is that David, who was teaching at Harvard at the time, had reached out to me a little bit after the point at which What We See When We Read came out. And I had gone up to Cambridge to do some lectures on that book. I gather that some of the students were interested in talking about it. So that's how I met David. And, I went up and I gave a more general lecture on the book jacket as well, because that was the moment the cover had come out as well. So I was sort of touring with those 2 books. And David and I just sort of hit it off. He had been teaching a class on... Basically, it was, if I'm remembering correctly, it was a literature class in which he was using design and design terminology as sort of a way in, as a sort of critical tool to understand big literary texts. So at the point at which I had come into that class, they had just read Gravity's Rainbow, by Thomas Pynchon, which is a book I love, a very difficult book. But so the first class that I taught was on the visual signifiers in Gravity's Rainbow. So I sort of talked through the way that Pynchon used visual metaphor and how it functioned for him in that book. And part of the assignment for the kids, I can't remember if they could choose between writing an essay or making a design, or whether they had to do both. This was a while ago already. But in any case, a bunch of those students ended up, for credit, making designs that portrayed the book Gravity's Rainbow. The idea was, to what extent can design be used not just as a way to brand something and sell it into a marketplace, but to what extent can it be used as a tool for unpacking narrative, or for trying to explain narrative, or something that's not even narrative. So for, in the case of that class, we talked about the way that Pynchon uses all kinds of visual signifiers, but with a special emphasis on sort of American vernacular design, everything from like Walt Disney cartoons to, Bazooka Joe gum wrappers to zoot suits to all the stuff that appears in that book, because Pynchon obviously is a big fan of sort of like demotic American culture. So that became a part of the lecture. And then there was a slew of other Harvard classes, and David and I became very close friends. And the idea, we were talking a lot about book jackets at that moment. And of course, I was also encountering historians of the book at Harvard. There are some really wonderful ones there, and had after lecture dinners with other professors there in which we sort of discussed what a book wrapping is and where it comes from and what it means. And so David and I just decided this would be a good project, and we pitched it, and publishers seemed interested, and 10 Speed bought it. And, and it was a funny thing because like right at the moment that we had sort of signed on the dotted line to make this book with 10 Speed Crown was around the moment that I really stopped being a book designer. I had left trade publishing at that point. Knopf was where I worked, but also was freelancing for pretty much everybody at that moment, and started writing fiction and doing a slew of other kinds of branding work to make ends meet, and then ended up at The Atlantic, where I'm the creative director now. So strangely, this book, the look of the book that David and I worked on together, was kind of an apt sort of swan song for me as a book designer, and allowed me to sort of throw a lot of love into just looking at, the long and interesting history of book covers and book jackets, and learn a lot myself, frankly. I mean, both David and I, I'd say, learned a lot making this book. I certainly learned a ton from David about the sort of academic history of the book jacket, and he learned a lot from me about how the sausage gets made, because, I had all that practical experience, 20 years of it almost.
What I found remarkable about your work and a number of your contemporaries, and some of these people are great fodder in the book, in the look of the book too, where you were able to, get some of your contemporaries to talk about the backstories of one particular cover or the other, almost as these elongated captions, sort of mini freestanding anecdotes.
Yeah.
And
I mean, we were constrained by page length, which is really sad because there's so much material from designers that I would give anything to just have the room to throw in there. But yeah, go on.
No, but I loved it because you get into process, and I think that is, for me, I sort of work on a different side of this, but it's a lot of inside baseball that I don't think most people know. And this is such a great book for someone who wants to get their head into like how this stuff comes about. And there's lots of great little anecdotal history bits. I mean, I always knew that famous Emerson quote, that he wrote to
right.
Walt Whitman, but I didn't know was that it was gold foil stamped on early editions as like cell copy, which
right.
makes total sense. But, I didn't know that. And then similarly, you've got, these great anecdotes.
I think Emerson was horrified by that,
Why? Because the publisher didn't get the clearance. They just did it.
Yeah, and I mean, we've all been in that position too, like on either end of it, where somebody who you admire sends you a note saying like, I really liked X, Y, or Z, and you're like, can I use this as a blurb? It's like, and some of us have too much shame to actually ask the person, and then some of us have so little shame, like Walt Whitman, that we'll just use it anyway.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, fortunately, I think the way book blurbs work seems a little bit more cut and dry and more of I guess, sort of a fairer process than the way I see stuff done with films, where one word can be ellipsed on both sides to denote something that means the exact opposite of what was written. But there's some great stuff though in the book about just, I guess this comes down to just kind of the history of the modern book jacket, and I assume some of this stuff maybe you guys had researched for this class, or maybe David knew about this because
it was just for the book.
Oh, it was just for the book.
I mean, he knew some of this. Yeah, he knew some of this. He was not a book scholar. He was, he's really more a philosopher, literary theorist. His first book was about fine art. And he's written a fair amount about design and articles about design. But for him, this was really, like for me, a kind of learning experience. I did my own crash course in design. I didn't go to design school. And I'm not even sure if at design school you learn history of design. But I didn't know the first thing about the history of design. All I knew is what I had seen that had been inspiring to me. So from my vantage point, it was just a great kind of research assignment. And I think for David as well, although he knew more than I knew. But like, for instance, I've always loved the Penguin science fiction series, and they had been on my parents' shelves and had very much, without my knowing it, influenced the way I design. And for this book, I got to look up who did them, and then I got to contact him. It's David Pelham, by the way, who's a design genius, and who I had known absolutely nothing about. And it was an incredible excuse, as it were, to sort of like excavate those influences, and a great excuse to also just have some contact with somebody like that who would be not just a progenitor of the work that I did, but like a real hero to me. Like his work still stands, I think, as some of the greatest book designs, the J.G. Ballards in particular, ever done. I mean, not to mention Clockwork Orange and Lawrence Ratskin, who is, his covers I had seen, like The Franchiser, for instance, is a good example of that. I had seen his covers before on big hardcovers from the 70s, had absolutely no idea who had made them, what his name was, until I literally started I literally had to find out who made them for this book because they're just such influential and beautiful covers. And then it turns out that almost everything that he did, that Lawrence Ratskin made, was just kind of my ideal form of design. So it's just like I learned so much. I really come to this, again, not as an expert or a scholar, just like a practitioner and someone who's just a true enthusiast.
One thing that I always think about, seeing how quickly you guys have to churn these covers out when you were working in-house at a publisher, is, God, do they have time to read all this stuff? I mean, especially these sort of doorstopper novels. And watching, for instance, the Staten Island piece in the book where you sort of get into what Tom was doing with that novel and how that led into the sort of design and theory concept. And I think somewhere in the book you guys say that this book itself is really just an experiment in literary theory and design.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. It is that. I mean, to answer the question implicit in there, like I came to design as a reader, not as a designer. And so for me, the reading of the books was the draw. I probably would have ended up doing something else if it hadn't been for the fact that, the job that was offered for me was at Knopf. It was actually Vintage, which is the paperback line of Knopf, hardcover line, at that moment by John Gall, who was the first person who hired me. And the books were all great, and that's why I ended up doing it. So, the truth is, for me, it was about the reading. There was definitely a moment by the time I really quit as a book designer, where I had sort of had enough of just like the manuscript churn and just having to constantly like digest all of these manuscripts. It just became too much. And actually the worst part about it was that it sort of meant that I didn't have any time to read the books I wanted to read anymore. Like there was no discretionary reading. It was just like, just a constant flow of trade fiction and nonfiction. And, I miss to some extent, knowing ahead of time what are the books that are in the pipeline and just the excitement of being like an early reader on things. I definitely miss that, but I don't miss being given these long lists of things to read. And there's also just the pressure of designing all those things simultaneously. I mean, when I wrote, the difference between, the time that I wrote, during which I wrote the look of the book, and when I wrote cover, is when I was working on cover, I was still at that moment, doing whatever it was. If you include the freelance with the stuff that I was doing in-house at Knopf, probably like anywhere between 25 and 40 books a list, probably designing 10 at any given moment. And that was because I was loving it and I was doing it because of the sheer joy of design, but it was too much, whereas by the time the look of the book came around, like I said, I wasn't really designing anymore and I could just sort of like look back in fondness. So it's a very different point of view.
Well, and I think you get into some of the techniques of, it's almost like a crash course on nerding out on how to make stuff. I mean, I'm sort of doing production stuff all day, so I'm quoting out what a tipped photo cost or what a foil stamp costs and all this stuff. So I think the book is really wonderfully instructive in if you want to understand sort of nuts and bolts of this. And then I think some of the anecdotal stuff, which I didn't know, or maybe I did know, but you've recollected and recontextualized it. Like I remember always hearing that Salinger hated that paperback of Catcher in the Rye. Any depiction of, of Holden Caulfield was, not allowed. And so henceforth the covers were always just those standard text treatment covers, or the fact that Kafka, for instance, never wanted an insect on the cover of the Metamorphosis, and virtually no one listened to him.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting because, the word, you probably know this, but the word in Metamorphosis is not, in fact, insect, and it's not, in fact, bug. It's vermin, which could be interpreted in a number of different ways. And I don't know if he wanted to just keep that door open or whether he just didn't think that anybody would buy a book with a bug on the cover. But, and Salinger is an interesting case too, because, first of all, I really like those, the Salingers that just have the little rainbow and the sort of all type treatment. I think they're very handsome, actually. But in terms of production techniques, I always thought that was an extremely fun part of the job, was the actual process of making the things, how ink hits paper and debossing and embossing and the various kinds of laminates and finishes. And I sort of geeked out over that stuff. And we definitely wanted to put that stuff in the book. I think it's sort of interesting to note that, a lot of my favorite book designs historically are designs that are no more than, sometimes just 2 or 3 colors with no fancy die cuts or anything particularly extravagant going on. And in fact, one of my favorite lines of book covers are the sort of, the late 20th century New Direction paperbacks, which are just black and white and extremely, extremely simple. And, it's one of the things that I'm contending with now with these 2 new book lines that I'm working on, is when you can do anything you want. Especially in this one that involves both, where we're working with a high-end gallery, and, there's all the money in the world to make these things. Like, the choices are kind of infinite, and still part of me just wants to be like, well, why can't we just do black and white, and why can't it just be a paperback? And, that I used to think when I first started that the more production techniques you could use, the better the book design, but that's certainly not true.
You talk about in the book this idea of the anti-cover, which I think to people who don't really, know much about design or about how books are made and sold, but that's become, I think kind of a popular thing in the last decade or two. And I wonder if you could unpack the sort of concept of the anti-cover. Well,
with trade publishing constantly pushing for more on jackets, and by more, I mean, like more colors, more special effects, like I said, but also more blurbs and bigger titles and bigger author names. And, there comes a sort of saturation point where the marketplace, it's not only just that all the books begin to look the same, but there's just too much to look at. And when there's too much to look at, I have found in my career as a designer, people look at nothing. And I'm constantly trying to explain to clients in particular that, making a lot of things big doesn't make them prominent. And all you're doing is crowding a space so that the eye doesn't know where to go. So, there was this kind of moment where I think smart publishers were looking at this sort of excess and thought to themselves, well, what if we did the opposite? Like, what if we just used typography on a blank background? And it definitely got attention. And, I'm not necessarily like your average customer for these things. Like, I look at them as a book designer and as a reader, and I'm sort of steeped in this stuff. But I have to say, like, it's so refreshing for me in the capacity of a reader and a book designer to buy a book that doesn't have something on the cover other than the title and the author name. It's just like it's like a sensory deprivation tank. It just feels so great. It's so simple. It's so unfussy. You're getting the important information you want. And just to give an example of one of these, Fitzcarraldo is the first one that comes to mind, which is a publishing line that does fiction, nonfiction. I believe the fiction are blue backgrounds with white type, and the nonfiction is a white background with blue type. and the typography is extremely elegant and spare, and there's no imagery at all. And I was in a position recently where I was buying a book by Brian Dillon, I think, in the darkroom maybe, or maybe it was his book on essays called Essayism. But I was looking at the two editions, the American edition, which was done by New York Review of Books, and the UK edition, which Fitzcarraldo did. And I just really wanted the one that didn't have any pictures on it. So, it's like I order it from Amazon UK and then you just like wait around. And
No, I think you're right. I think there's a uniformity too. You touch on this in the book where you're having a dialogue with Sarah McNally. She says to you, at first I thought, I would love to have everything so uniform, like the way that publishers like are in Paris, for instance, where there is this kind of, simplicity and uniformity. I can see from a bookseller's point of view how putting this stuff out on tables with strong visual content, probably does work for the average person, and where you and I are probably anomalies, right? We're sort of the avant-garde who want something that, like Fitzcarraldo, where there's like a little deboss on the cover and it's very minimalist.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you've landed, though, in a really good spot where you can still kind of dip into books without having to sort of live and breathe it. I always admired that you would do these, contemporary books like Tom McCarthy, but then you'd, repackage Cortazar or something, and you'd have to go read these, these, and they're incredible books like Hopscotch, but they're also door stoppers, and you had to read presumably all of the Kafka stuff when you redid all of that, and Ulysses.
The pandemic for me. The pandemic for me was the story of Proust, which I'd never gotten past the first volume, and I just decided, and actually because of Sarah McNally, who you mentioned, who's a friend of mine, who's a big Proust fan and advocate, was trying to get me to read them. So I was just like, okay, well, I'm locked indoors. I might as well read, the largest novel in Western culture, and I'll probably be finishing the entire cycle this week, but it's been a calendar year.
Wow.
That I've been in Proust. That's how long it's taken. And it's an extremely rewarding experience. But that's exactly the kind of project I never would have been able to do, on my own steam when I was working in publishing, because I would have to, there's so many contemporary novelists and nonfiction writers whose manuscripts I would be plowing through. I wouldn't really have a chance to dive into a real project like that. But in terms of the Fitzcarraldo stuff, I think, Sarah's right from a mercantile point of view. I think customers really want to be able to, they want more information, and at a glance, they want to know, for instance, like genre, that's a big one. Like they just want to know if this book fits within a certain kind of writing tradition, if it's like other books that they've themselves read and liked before. There is this, the book jacket sort of does perform something similar to the Amazon algorithm in that way. It does tell you, hey, if you liked blah, 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 then you'll like this, because the jackets are similar and they use the same sorts of tropes and, which is something on the one hand I totally understand. On the other hand, also rubs me a little the wrong way, because my favorite books are the ones that are uncategorizable. I was just read Kaz Ishiguro's new book, Clara and the Sun, which is, like his last book, Buried Giant, is sort of, it's a little bit genre, right? It's told from the point of view of an AI. I guess you could say it's science fiction on some level, but it's not really, but neither is it sort of straight up literary fiction either. So, and I love that. So, but I do admit of being a total anomaly. I guess, the thing for me about the undesigned, the unformatted things, the Gallimar's and Paris, or the old Penguins, or the Fitzcarraldos, is that I wonder, with all the visual excess that's bombarding us, whether, it's TikTok or Insta or whatever it is, or it's just in a bookstore or on Amazon or wherever you are, there's just so much visual information. I just wonder what the reset looks like. Where do we get to a place where we can kind of recalibrate? And, I think especially with the pandemic and this sort of, it's not even sort of the ascendancy of digital culture, but the absolute necessity for digital culture. We spend all day looking at an RGB color space, and we're looking at images, and everything's bright and everything's poppy, and sometimes things move, and but it's just like a constant flood. It's a real flood. So for me to see that Fitzcarraldo edition, it feels a little bit like a breath of fresh air and a little bit of getting back to those less is more days. But we'll see. We'll see. I'm very curious what, I happen to suspect that book design, in terms of what it's capable of doing, that it's sort of shot its wad on some level, that it's like, I haven't been shocked by a book cover in well over a decade. And I mean in a good way, like surprised, like seeing a book cover where I thought that really breaks new ground or makes me look in a different way or think in a different way. But I'm really hopeful that it still has the capacity to do that. So we'll see.
I can see too, just from your vantage point, where I'm in a bookshop and you can tell that there's this kind of copycat mentality where, something did well, so now we need to pick that font and that color scheme and run with it. And it's almost, so I'm with you on the sort of uniformity and the simplicity of all that, because it kind of cuts that part of it out. And I know some of that is sometimes market pressure from like a bookstore chain that, wants something simpler. Like you said, sometimes they think bigger is better. And hopefully, as bookshops become more curated things, I think the future of bookstores is obviously highly tenuous, but the places that are going to survive are going to be somewhat less general interest stores and big box stores and more curated. I mean, Sarah's kind of an anomaly even in her sort of field, in that you see the new stores have a restaurant and bar in there to sort of offset the cost of how difficult it is to have a so-called general interest bookstore nowadays that has a little bit of everything. And, it certainly seems that it's moving into this hyper niche, and you see it with record shops as well, which, I think is a good thing, but at the same time, it removes that browsing mentality where you might stumble on something you weren't already looking for, Yeah. And my favorite bookstores, honestly, and my last sort of money-making job that wasn't playing the piano before I was a designer was working in a bookstore in Manhattan, Books and Company, which is a very famous independent bookstore next to the Whitney Museum on Madison Avenue. And it was so brilliantly curated. It was always the case that somebody who came in would report that they bought something, not just that they didn't know about, but in a field that was so far flung from what they expected to be buying. And in fact, the store was sort of arranged so that, like, for instance, to get to the blockbusters, you had to wade through philosophy and so many of the books were faced out to sort of maximize impact, and specifically the impact of the designs. It was just, those were the good days of point of purchase. One of the things I missed more than anything in the pandemic was actually being able to just walk into a bookstore. I mean, especially where I live in Manhattan, there are just very, very few good public spaces. I don't know if people know that about Manhattan. It's, there are more than there used to be. Like, we have the High Line now. But a lot of the public spaces like Central Park or whatever are kind of huge and forbidding, and they're not great places to kind of people watch or be in a space with other people sort of doing something else casually the way you would at, like, in Paris at a cul-de-sac at a cafe. And bookstores, in a way, are one of the last places in Manhattan where that can actually happen. And the fact that it's like a locus of culture and reading and the life of the mind and the intellect, I think is just a wonderful bonus. But I just, when I was locked in my house, I just so missed being able to walk into a bookstore and, like, watch people browse and see what people are thinking and be able to see how people are designing and all of that. So I really do hope that it, whatever form the independent bookstore takes, that it not only survives but thrives. We'll see. The Look of the Book by Peter Mendelsund and David Alworth, published by 10 Speed Press, is available now in hardcover. For the reading this episode, Peter Mendelsund, who seems to like to release books in pairs, reads from his wildly inventive novel The Delivery, published by FSG Books. Here's Peter Mendelsund reading from his latest novel.
He slid into the street, displacing humid air and leaving behind him a thick fog of apprehension. He reached up to flip his helmet's visor down, but did not. The air was warm, yes, but fresh, and he didn't want anything between him and it. The light, clear and yellow. He got off the bike, took off the helmet, strapped it down to the rack. He straddled the seat, leaned forward, and pushed with both legs, clicking on the power assist, which ground out one single, concise complaint before finding its groove and humming once more. He set off up the wide boulevard. A quick glance in the small, round rear view, and he saw the warehouse withdraw. The sidewalk outside it was empty. Green light, green light, green light. He wove among the cars, finding lanes that shouldn't have existed, spaces that were folded and unfolded by the flow of traffic. He knew every move of each vehicle on the street and, anticipating, made the most of it, cutting up the roadway in unexpected shapes, his bike a blade, and he found himself laughing at drivers, taunting the other delivery boys. He leaned far to one side and then corrected to the other, never having to stop at lights, crosswalks, never having to dismounting at intersections. He thought of this as a failure in a kind of child's game. And soon the way opened up. Looking ahead as he coasted, he began to feel the neighborhood around him transform. But into what? All the streets and roundabouts he had become intimate with over these days and months, for who knows how long. Those streets that he had once believed would always be part of a disorienting and alien future, this old route was perhaps now becoming precisely that. Old. Scenery. Part of the long unfurling of his past. Now he was moving toward something, and that something was getting it right. This, he concluded, was being a man about things, which meant insisting and then accepting, no, embracing the penalties for such insistence, declaring one's feelings and being rebuked if necessary. This was it. Yes, there were new debts to be paid, and yes, the path was not without peril, but the delivery boy now noticed a fresh excitement surge out from some subterranean spring, an excitement at traveling outside the tightly belted limits of his old circumscribed life. He was full up, ready, as if the world were suddenly and unaccountably available, affordable, proffered. In that moment, he felt nothing but this strange upwelling sense of agency. He released his grip, tucked his legs up, closed his eyelids slightly against the wind and felt it play on his teeth and on the back of his throat. He opened and closed his mouth, and as he did so, the wind produced the snap of a bitten, red, yellow, green fruit. The delivery boy saw the borderlands of his old neighborhood as a new series of discrete pictures, as if he were already transcribing the saga of his own great journey. A tall, striped stack made of stamped tin, jutting out of the middle of the avenue gouting smoke. He and the rest of the traffic divided around it and slackened, as if the street and all of its noise, motion, and commerce, and even the delivery boy himself, were powered by currents of underground steam, which, now leaking, lost vital energy and slowed the entire apparatus. An old man angled forward, bent almost in half as he walked, his hands clasped behind his back. A young man leaning against a lamppost, smoking. He had a dog on a leash. A young woman approached, bent down, and spoke to the dog. The young man took a last drag of his cigarette, flicked it away. The late afternoon sun perched directly on a chimney like an egg in an egg cup. A man flipping and dropping a coin while another man watched. A doorman spraying down the already wet sidewalk with a hose. 3 women gathered over a phone and smiling as if they were bending over a cradle. A man driving past him in a car that was shiny and yellow, and though the delivery boy thought the yellow was wicked, he wondered what it must be like to drive that car on days when the driver felt sad. A visibly crazy woman gibbering into a roadside help box, a man carrying a mirror across a street, which is to say, an unexpected, if brief and blurred, portrait of a ragged, determined delivery boy.
support Big Table, go to bigtablepodcast.org/bookshop. You can help us and independent bookstore culture at the same time. Big Table is produced and presented by Hat and Beard Press, Dub Lab, and Gold Diggers in Los Angeles, and is supported by Invisible Republic, a nonprofit arts organization based in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. You can learn more about their community-based programs and publications at invisiblerepublic.org. Big Table would not exist in the audio world without the expert skill sets, friendship, and dedication of sound designer and editor Matea Bain and audio engineer Jacob Ross. Special thanks to Eric Gorman at Gold Diggers and Alejandro Ale Cohen at Dub Lab for early encouragement and engineering prowess. Thanks again for listening.